Today I wanted to do another video in the continuation of my record collection series that I've been doing for the last couple years. Slow moving series, trickling out videos, 1 or 2, 3 a year. Not a regular here on YouTube, thus my subscriber count and my views, but nevertheless, there is some interest out there for some of the things I'm talking about, and I wanted to continue today specifically with my record collection as it refers to emo. Now, if you've watched my past few videos, and I recommend that you do, you'll know that the type of records that I'm collecting here, vinyl records, in the emo subgenre, is less to do with the mid-2000s popular form of the genre that people are more commonly familiar with, sort of pop-punk iteration of the genre, and more the 80s and 90s hardcore subgenre of emotive hardcore, which is what it started out as before it developed into more of an indie rock thing and then more of a pop-punk thing. So I'll talk a little bit about that evolution in this video through some of the records that I'm talking about, because what I have here kind of covers the gamut. Just going ahead into what I'm showing here is generally more obscure, and not like a cool hipster, I'm better than everyone sort of way, but just you were less likely to be familiar with the bands that I'm showing, unless you are intimately familiar with the genre. If you're not, hopefully this is a good place to learn. And like I said, please go back and watch parts 1 and 2 of this. I have the majority of my emo LPs, and then a bunch of singles. This is going to be a mix of both, and we're going through the 80s, the 90s, and now, as they say on the radio. The first thing to show here is this single by the band Sideshow. This came out in 1991, and Sideshow were an interesting band. Sideshow was kind of a very, what's the word I want to use? A very transitional band. When I'm talking about, how the genre sort of was a evolution of hardcore American punk, and later kind of started bleeding into the realms of indie rock, and later much further pop punk. This band is really sort of in the crosshairs of when it was still kind of a hardcore thing, and when indie rock started to creep in to the equation here. Obviously, this band, when listening, you hear a lot of like the Discord Records, DC, proto-emo that was happening in the 80s. There's a whole lot of bands like Rites of Spring and Embrace and Dag Nasty going on this record, but you hear a little bit of the tenseness of that, and the guitar interplay and things like that we became familiar with at that time. But you also hear a little bit of some poppier elements. A little more hooks, more melody, and Sideshow ended up, I think this was the first band on the record label Caulfield, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe the label was created by the band to release their own material, and then later they started releasing other bands, but Caulfield Records later became a big mover and shaker in the 90s indie emo or Midwest emo sound. So this is kind of where it starts, and this is good. This is a good single. There's a few really good songs on here. I'm thinking the track listing is Right, Gulf, if I'm pronouncing that correct, Winter, and Mistake, and I want to say it was the second song on side A that really caught my attention. Some really fun melodic guitar work. Alright. Okay, and from West Virginia, we have another early emotive hardcore band, Lincoln. And these guys were really influential. And I wasn't aware of this until I looked up their releases on Discogs, but they actually did not release that much. There's a few singles, I think 2 or 3 singles, and then a split they did with the Discord band Hoover, which is a heavily sought after split, easily the most expensive thing of theirs to buy online, and hardest thing to find out in the wild. But this, I think this is their first single they released, and it's called Sugarloaf and on side A, and Waterboy on side B. And these guys had definitely a DC sound. A lot of what I'm going to be showing here does, even though they were a West Virginia band. If you look up video of them, you can find a few performances of theirs on YouTube. And you look at the way that the singer is kind of standing on stage with his guitar, and he has his hat kind of crooked to the side, and the way he sort of approaches the mic, his stage energy is very, very, very much like Ian MacKay's during the early Fugazi days, and a lot of the music kind of has that feel too. But they're like a lot of the emotive hardcore bands, they sort of take what was going on in DC and with Fugazi, and they take out a lot of the funk and reggae elements of Fugazi, the real rhythmic stuff, and then add in this kind of intensity, a sort of wretched, impassioned quality to the music that sort of separates it from traditional DC hardcore. But this is, yeah, pretty rare, pretty cool to find. Alright, from Canada, Ontario, Canada, we have another split. I guess it's the first split that I'm showing here, but it won't be the last. From Watershed and Shopmaker. I'm not as familiar with Watershed, but Shopmaker did a split with the band Maximilian Kolbe, and Maximilian Kolbe is one of my favorite mid-90s emotive hardcore bands, and they have this really tense, sparse kind of approach to the genre, this very dynamic, quiet, loud thing going on. But Watershed, or Shopmaker, less so, but still really good. Very kind of a churning guitar sound, and again, sort of harkening back to the DC hardcore sound. But yeah, you know, there's a few emotive hardcore bands come out of Canada, but not a ton. But they did manage the sound, the style, as underground as it was during the 90s, did manage to make it up there. But yeah, another cool emo single. Try to show that. And this is off of Vital Communications. This is all still from the same pickup at Amoeba. Okay, I have the single called At the Window of Vulnerability from the band Julia. And this was released before their LP. Their LP, if you've seen as a cover, the black cover with a kind of a black and white drawing or charcoal drawing of like a boat at sea, like an old ship. Very popular within the world of people who collect emotional hardcore music. And Julia, like, they were kind of a little later on. I think this came out in 94. In 93, 94, 95, this is sort of the peak years of this style before the sort of the post-Sunny Day Real Estate sound begins to dominate. But they sort of took the emotional wrenching quality of it much further than other bands, and they really stretch out the dynamics. Their songs are often a lot longer, but not necessarily these. These are still a little bit more connected to hardcore, so it's a little bit more to the point, and almost, there's one song in here that's pretty close to chaotic hardcore, so it starts to get a little screamy, and starts to become much more sort of in your face, which was also another sort of style that was going on at the time. But a lot of their songs, if you listen to them, almost get into the realms of post-rock. and but not necessarily the stuff on this single. But this is really good. Okay. We have another split single. This is from Crank Records between Vitreous Humor and the Kansas City band Boys Life. Vitreous Humor single, or the song here, Why Are You So Mean to Me, is kind of more of an indie rock thing. It's kind of a straight sort of college rock sound. There's a little bit of a emo-ish influence in there, I suppose, in sort of a Garden Variety sort of way. And by Garden Variety, I'm talking about the band Garden Variety. Or Sensefield, like that sort of like, if there is such a thing, that's sort of emo grunge cringe. I don't really want to say that, but that's kind of a description I could use. But yeah, it has sort of a bouncy, sort of indie popish feel to it. Sort of fuzzy guitars, and it sounds like something that you could hear on a Linklater movie in the 90s or something. I don't know. The Boys Life track, however, is one of the most like overtly hardcore influenced songs I've heard. And Boys Life was a very popular indie emo band from the 90s, and are often credited as being a huge influence on the later sort of more popular stuff. But this song, if I didn't know better, just having heard it without any context, I would have thought that it was a straight up emotive hardcore band, or even sort of a wiry sort of post-hardcore band like Drive Like Jehu or something like that. Which I'll say this about Boys Life, and I might say it again when I show some other stuff of theirs. I think Boys Life, of all of those bands, the sort of Midwest emo bands, meaning the bands that took it in a much more kind of softer melodic territory, after bands like Sunny Day Real Estate got really popular, Boys Life, I think, was one of the bands that really retained that early tense hardcore dynamics. A lot of those bands either sort of supplanted those dynamics with something else, or almost kind of replaced it with more kind of a poppier approach. But the way I always kind of describe Boys Life is they sound like if an indie rock band tuned Drive Like Jehu's guitars. Okay, now we're going to get into the LPs, and I don't have quite as many, but this is some pretty interesting stuff as well. And I think some of these I found at Permanent Records in Huntington Park. Not Huntington Park, Highland Park, which is northeast Los Angeles. But here I have a couple from, and I'm going to kind of take these apart. The band Still Life, I think I talked about them in one of the other videos. I know I did. Still Life from Moore Park, California, just a few miles north of LA. And these are some of their earlier releases. This is called Slow Children at Play. This is actually an 8-inch, not a 7-inch, not a 10 or 12-inch, an 8-inch, which you don't see very often. But this is pretty cool. It comes with a lyric sheet. So there's your lyrics. And on the other side is a full-blown poster, still in very good condition. Still Life are another transitional band, I think, like Sideshow, that some of their songs are very, very hardcore influenced, and some of them are very, very melodic, and they use, lots of pretty arpeggiated, twinkly guitars, and they will have songs that are palm muted and chuggy in sort of an East Coast hardcore way. So they're, they like to play with those sort of contradictions and dynamics a lot in their music, and they were one of the longest lasting of this genre, this kind of emotional hardcore stuff. They were a little bit more popular than a lot of these bands. I think the common trend for a lot of these emo-core bands or emotive hardcore bands were that they didn't last very long. They would release a single, or a series of splits, and then they would break up. And then, somebody, their record label or whoever ended up owning the music later, would compile all their stuff in like one CD that you could buy 3 or 4 years after the band was already totally broke up. That was not uncommon for this specific era, but still I lasted a while. They started, I think, in the late 80s, early 90s, and went all the way on until like 2001 or 2. I remember the time that I discovered them in the early 2000s when I was in high school. They were still a band, but not for much longer. But yeah, this is some early stuff of theirs. So there's some melodic kind of balladeering, I guess you could say. As close as a hardcore band ever got to doing that. But there's also some more screamy, intense stuff on here as well. And this, which came with it, they were kind of sold together. It's Slow Children at Play and Beyond. So this has all the tracks that are on the single, or on the 8-inch, but it has a few other ones. And I was a little more excited about this because it has one of my favorite still life songs, or I think the first song I ever heard by them when I found them online, called Sometimes. And they've recorded this song a few times, and I want to say the newer recording of this song that's in a different compilation was not as good. It was too polished, in my opinion. But this one, from when they were first starting out, is really interesting because it has very confessional, tortured emo lyrics, but the music is very East Coast hardcore sounding. Even though they're a California band, it has that kind of tough guy moshy sort of quality to it, and you don't hear that as much from them. And it's interesting that was sort of the song that romanced me into the band, and then the rest of their music is a little more melodic, or a little bit more jingly, or a little bit more higher up the neck kind of chords. This stuff is, or the song Sometimes, is a really interesting gateway, I guess you could say, into emotive hardcore, because it leans a little bit closer to hardcore than the rest of their music. But yeah, big Still Life fan. Alright, this is the double LP compilation album, like I was talking about before, from Moss Icon. This includes all of their music that they released as a band. Moss Icon is very formative of the genre. After they were one of the first bands to kind of continue on the sort of tradition of DC emotive hardcore sound outside of DC. They were from Annapolis, so not too far from that area, but they were one of the bands, I think probably one of the first bands that really developed the style out of taking it out of sort of the context of sort of a DC post-hardcore punky kind of thing, and sort of deciding the songs don't have to follow any kind of punk rules anymore. Like, it can still be hardcore, it can still be underground, it can still have this kind of DIY aesthetic, but it doesn't have to follow the traditions of the fast, sort of frantic, out of breath, minor thready kind of sound anymore. That even bands like Rites of Spring, as influential as they are, still kind of clung to a little bit. This band, the songs are much slower. Not all of them. Some of them are kind of punky, but they were the first ones to sort of slow down the songs. They could be, you know, instead of 2 to 3 minutes, they could be 4, 5, 6 minutes long, and they really maximize the dynamics a lot, going from very, very quiet to loud, and building up to crescendos and these climaxes. And yeah, very important band. I'll say that. A lot of what we later hear in emo, including bands like Still Life, and a lot of the bands that I showed in those singles, owe basically everything they did to this band. You know, they invented a lot of the ideas, or furthered them more than other bands did. Let's see. Okay, last two, but very important stuff here. We have the album Departures and Landfalls from Boy's Life, which I talked about in those singles. This is a slightly later pressing. This originally came out in 1996, but I want to say this was repressed. This one was repressed by Headhunter in 2003, 2004, 6, like somewhere in there. Now the album is being distributed by a newer label called Top Shelf Records, which is pushing forward a lot of this emo revival stuff, or these very new bands, very, very young bands in the indie rock world. Yeah, you know, I talked about Boy's Life a lot already. This is, I think, probably their most popular album. They had another LP before this, but this one, I think, is where people are most familiar with their music. This has an interesting production sound. The first time I heard the song Fire Engine Red, which was the first song I heard by them, which I believe is the first single, or the first song on this. This is a gatefold. The first time I heard it, I thought it was like a corrupted bad recording, or like a, you know, recorded off of like a cassette tape or something, because it has a weird production sound where the first time you hear it, it sounds kind of intentionally bad. Like the guitars are kind of muffled and low in the mix, and then like the vocals seem like 1,000 miles away, sort of being like almost like the singer didn't have a mic and he was just trying to sing as loud as he could over the band without a microphone. But then the more you listen to the record, the further you get into it, you realize that production technique is sort of intentional. And this is one of my favorite record covers. I love just the stark black thing, and then just this long, narrow image here. It speaks to everything I think this band and sort of this era of the genre sort of did. But yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. And lastly, maybe my favorite band of the sort of softer indie emo, mid-90s Midwest emo sound, even more so than, you know, more popular bands like Sunny Day Real Estate or later Jimmy Eat World or whatever, is the Colorado band Christie Front Drive. And Christie Front Drive were really good friends with both Jimmy Eat World and Boy's Life. They did a split single with Jimmy Eat World early on, and actually helped Jimmy Eat World get signed to Capitol Records in the mid-90s. And kind of funny, because they were the band that had been around longer. They're the ones that I think probably had a better handle on their genre, on their sound. Jimmy Eat World was still kind of figuring out what they were doing in 1996, which is why their first album, Static Prevails, is quite a bit different than the rest of their music. Although I do really like that album. Go back and listen to it if you haven't. But yeah, Christie Front Drive kind of got passed over. They're not as well known. And they put out a lot of music. I think they had about 3 LPs worth of music that you can find, plus a lot of split singles and compilations that they put out there, and songs they did for different comps during that time. And they have just their music's really beautiful. You know, they have the guitar interplay in there. They sort of take those. They were one of those bands I was saying that sort of took the tense dynamics of emotive hardcore and sort of replaced it with, instead of this kind of dissonance of those bands, the guitars and the melodies are sort of in more harmony with each other, and you know, instead of this kind of churning forward like you're about to churn right over a cliff, which is sort of what the emotive hardcore bands are trying to elicit out of you when you're listening to the music. Their stuff is more sort of this hopeful kind of sound, these bass lines that kind of climb up, and these major key kind of swells in their music, and it's like very overwhelming. You know, they sort of interpret the sort of emotional thing in a very different way than the emotive hardcore bands, which were all about making this kind of nervous hardcore music. These bands are more sort of hopeful and dynamic and sort of longing, I guess is sort of a word I would use to describe when you're listening to their music. Very long songs, you know, 4 to 6 minutes long usually, and they're compositions, really. It's almost, again, almost kind of steering in the direction of later bands would definitely go into, of post-rock. You could take a lot of these songs and take the vocals out. They actually don't, as far as these bands go that were, you know, more melodic, there is singing on here, but they use very few lyrics. They don't, you know, they're not like Jimmy Eat World, which took a much more pop approach to the music, and you know, they have verses and choruses and a lot of lyrics, and some songs are very lyrically driven. They're not a lyrically driven band. It's much more about how the music makes you feel, even though the lyrics are there. But yeah, this is a cool recorded or release. This was released by Magic Bullet Records, although I don't believe they were the original label that this was put on. But this also came with a DVD of their last live performance before they broke up in, I want to say 96, 97. But yeah, go back and listen to Christie Front Drive. Very influential, again. So that's what I have. That's the video. And if you have any kind of opinions, or you have any kind of comments you want to make about the music that I've shown here or in other videos, please do so.